Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Strategies for Measuring Remote Team Performance webinar today. Thank you for taking out time out of your busy schedule with all that's going on to join us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So today's webinar is broken into a few parts. We're going to begin with introductions, then we're going to dive right into a framework for measuring remote team performance. Then we'll speak to you a little bit about how we can support you in establishing your metrics for your program. We'll allow you to submit your questions throughout the webinar. We'll answer as many as possible, and then we'll wrap up the webinar today. So first, let's do introduction. My name is Millie Armstrong Smith. I am the CEO of Manageroo. I've been leading and managing teams for the last 15 years within two industries. First was for Equinox Fitness Clubs. Within the fitness industry, I supported them to grow from 8 locations to over 30 nationally. And then I worked in the workforce development industry for New York City at one of the leading organizations providing job placement services to New Yorkers for the last 10 years. And so I'm really excited to provide some insights into how I supported other leaders and used a few of the best practices in today's presentation with my teams directly. I'd like to also introduce you to Samantha and invite her to share a little bit more about herself.
Sure, I'm Samantha Petrie-Quillen. I have spent my career building and scaling high growth tech startups, HR departments for the past 15 or so years. I am also a career and executive coach and work with my clients to really cultivate and plan through and think through not just a seat at the table, but how to leverage their voices and make impact within organizations. I joined Manageroo last year, in large part because of Millie's commitment to teams and to getting the best performance out of our teams and building best in class workplaces. So welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much. And so Samantha and I have focused over the last few months on supporting teams as they're going through, or the last few weeks as they're going through the transition with COVID. And there are various topics that have come up. We supported teams with strategies on how to lead a newly remote team. Just a few weeks ago, we've provided also a webinar around how to go beyond conference calls with more collaborative tools online. And one of the main questions that came up every time was, how do we measure performance of our remote team? The question was general, just measuring performance as a whole as an organization, but then also how do we do it now, considering that we're working remotely? And so that's what we will touch on today throughout the webinar. So to start off, we want to know who's joined us today. And so we have a question about our first poll. What is the most significant concern regarding measuring, your most significant concern regarding measuring performance for your team? Is it A, what to measure? B, when to measure it? C, how to measure your metrics? Or D, that you're getting your team's buy-in and commitment to the metrics you've established?
You can just put your answers right in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
That will work. Okay, C.
B?
C is in Charlie, how to measure. So how to measure is always, we're gonna touch on that. And so that's great. And thank you so much. That'll help influence how we sort of, run through these slides. So thank you.
Yes, and also just keeping in mind too that some of the content that we're going to cover before how to measure it will really create the foundation that's necessary for the answer to how to measure it to be easier and much more clear to you and your organization. Okay, so let's start off. Why measure performance? So we always begin with the why. Here are some of the top reasons for teams to measure performance. One, to align on key areas of organizational impact and health. So making sure everyone is aligned on how we're going to measure success as an org. To share the impact with internal and external parties. Without measuring the actual performance, it's difficult to tell your story. And measuring performance allows you to do that more clearly with data. To determine resource allocation, you'll be able to allocate which part of your resources, which part of your business needs the most resources based on how you're performing, and noticing where there might be a need or where you have too many resources allocated in another area where the need is not as substantial anymore. Then being able to proactively identify opportunities and challenges within your business. And you're able to proactively do that when you're managing performance and being able to use that information to make changes within your business. Then being able to assess the quality and impact of your services and your market share. How far is your reach as an organization, and what's the quality of the impact you're making? And lastly, and this is our favorite, it's to be able to celebrate and learn from success and failure. And so yes, we said celebrate success, which we all do, but also celebrating and learning from failure, because often failures help us to get better for the next step. And all of that, performance as a whole, and speak to the impact you're having within your community, with your customer and your community. So that's the why. Now we want to talk about where to start. So in this webinar, we're going to speak about.
I'm not sure where this is going. And where to start is really quite often a challenge.
Measuring performance when you're in the office, or if you're going to do it remotely, you want to begin with an assessment of your organization. So it begins with purpose. What's your organization purpose? And then what's the purpose of the teams within your organization? And this too is very important, because often there are conflicts within teams and within the organization about what should be measured, how, when, and what's important. And largely that's rooted in not having a unified understanding of the organizational purpose and understanding of the individual team purposes. So we suggest starting there. Then you want to move on to who are your customers and your stakeholders. So by taking account of who your customers and stakeholders are, you're able to then determine the services you're going to be providing to them, and that will help color what you're actually going to measure. And we'll speak a little bit more with examples going forward. Now, the biggest change in regards to measuring performance for a remote team or in-office team is really going to come on the way that you offer services. For example, if you usually have in-person sales meetings with your customers to provide a specific service, or in-person meeting with customers to provide a specific service, when you're a remote team, that might be digitally, which will also change the targets that you have associated with this. So this is where we found the largest change between in-office and remote. And then the last thing you want with just where to start is to be able to clearly identify your strategic objective and goals. So what is that target or targets that represent that you're making the purpose that you want within your client, your customer base, or within your community? And so we have an example for you. There's a youth program that's servicing youth within the city. So their purpose is to empower youth economically. The teams that we're highlighting for the purposes of this example are an account management team and a career management team. The account management team purpose is to source jobs and match youth to job opportunities. The career management team purpose is to recruit and prepare youth for job readiness. So now we know the overall purpose of that program. We know the teams that are at play. Then we're looking at the customers and the stakeholders. And it could be pretty obvious that the customers are, or participants as some call it, or the city youth. And also the stakeholders might be an agency that's agency or foundation that's provided the funding for this, or it could be an independent organization, a for-profit business. So, you know, so those two stakeholders are very clear. However, you want to always make sure that the leadership, you're considering the leadership within your business as a stakeholder as well, when you're determining what metrics to measure within for performance. Then looking at services, the services that this organization offer, job placement and skills training. And lastly, their strategic objective and goal is to improve job placement and retention rates for city youth by serving 300 youth within 1 year and supporting 200 of them to retain employment for 365 days. So this is the basics. For your organization, you want to take out some time and get this down on paper for your org. And if you do not have this clearly outlined on one page for your organization, beginning to talk about metrics and how you're going to measure performance becomes 10 times more difficult. So we suggest you start here with the basics as an anchor and really the foundation for you to build on what to measure. Okay. Next up, we're going to go into what to measure. I'm going to hand this over to Samantha.
Thank you. So, you know, when we think about metrics, I think the first piece is that you really have to be sure that you are identifying the key performance indicators for your organization and for your team, and make sure that those things are aligned to purpose-driven goals. So the requirements for determining metrics involve many of the details from the basics that we mentioned earlier, as well as forming a small multi-tier working group. And I can't stress that multi-tier enough. There needs to be representation from all levels of your organization, because often what happens is metrics get constructed or drafted by leadership teams and then handed down to the frontline staff, and that can really have a problem with buy-in. So if you allow frontline staff to be part of the process of creating the metrics, you'll see a really sharp, dramatic increase in buying and in adoption, and in full sort of ownership over the goals and metrics. You need to set aside a short amount of time, but a dedicated time to draft the metrics, where folks are focused, dialed in, and completely on board with moving those along. And we really think that it's important, especially now in this COVID moment, to be open and have an adaptable mind. You really got to be open-minded about what the metrics are and what the targets could look like. So it's really important to be open and get feedback from the collective body.
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to add about keeping, having the multi-tier staff members. Your customers, your line staff have a front row seat to your customers. So they're much more in tune with what's keeping them up at night, what's their pain points, and also some of the potential barriers. And so having their insights could really be helpful with establishing metrics. And then also, I know it seems counterintuitive that we have keep it short here for dedicating a time for metrics. And the reason is because whenever someone hears metrics or KPIs, it just, you know, immediately in their mind is this overcomplicated thing to attack. And what we want to do by saying keep it short is to encourage you to have a very dedicated time, but not to over analyze and over talk, kind of talking through what it is. And so that's our recommendation. So it's as painless as possible, but also effective. Okay, Samantha, you want to?
As a team, you really have to determine both quantitative and qualitative metrics by really working backwards from your strategic goals. So what kinds of resources, people, and partnerships are going to be needed, and what do you have currently? So understanding what you have and what you need is so important. What are the touch points that will get you to your target? I think we oftentimes forget that it is usually a layered process, and really understanding what the touch points are going to be so important. Also, what are the priorities of your key customers and stakeholders? And the reason that that is so beneficial is because we all know that we aim to really provide high value, quality, and service, because that has an impact in all areas of our business. So it's super important that we make sure that we understand what are our customers and stakeholders, what are their priorities, what are their values, and how do we make sure that we are consistently providing service to that end. And also, what are the action steps needed and required to hit each target? And the reason for that is to make sure that we are really making sure that the action steps to hit each target are equally as well thought out, especially in this moment. If all of the action steps needed, for instance, to hit a particular target are in person, then we could potentially need to look at some virtual options and need to get more creative in that way. And I want to suggest to you that one of the key points is to limit your metrics to the key indicators, ensuring that they are lean and easy for your team to understand. That's so important. Sometimes I think we sort of try to create, we over metrics folks, and it has to be the key things that will move your business when you're trying to create these metrics for your team, because that, again, a more streamlined approach will make sure that you increase adoption and increase your team members' buy-in.
Yes, and I'd like to add that for people who are for the data-driven people like me, I enjoy having a robust amount of information and tracking many data points. However, I may have a spreadsheet in my office that's looking at indicators for our business, and it maybe there are 20 or 30 different indicators I'm looking at, but those are not the key indicators that I would have shared with the team, because I don't know yet if those things are going to provide me information to further our purpose long term, and I don't want to overwhelm my team. So if you are someone who really loves a robust amount of data, do it, track it, that's fine, but you want to stick to the key indicators with what your team's looking at. And we have an example for you. So earlier we spoke about this youth program, Youth Go. Their strategic goal is to place 300 youth into employment and to have 2/3 of them sustain employment for a year. And so there are two teams that they have working on it. Their account management team, career advisement team. Now, and of course, we know that you have your HR team, your admin support team, and there are many other departments. For the sake of this webinar, we've placed the two departments that are directly forward-facing to the customers. So an example of how you can move from the strategic goal, the objective of offering job placement and retention services, and the strategic goal of enrolling 300 customers and having them retain employment, 200 of them retain employment, how we can move from there to the actual measurement, the actual metric that you're measuring, is by working backwards from that strategic goal. So you can begin with the question. We have to place place 300 customers into employment. So what do we need in order to actually have them gain a job? We need jobs. So we know for sure that we have to track the number of jobs that we are bringing into our organization in order to prepare to have enough opportunities for the 300 individuals to gain employment. And then the qualitative aspect of it is, well, how much time is it taking for between when we bring the jobs into our organization and when that opportunity is fulfilled? And that's really qualitative around, are we gathering the right opportunities? Or is our account management team talking to the right employers? Do they know enough about our customers to ensure that we have a fast fulfillment time frame. Then for the career advisement team, the career advisement, remember their purpose is to train and to recruit and to train the customers for with resumes and interviews. So if they're providing job readiness, if they're recruiting customers and providing job readiness, what we need first for job readiness are resumes and interviews. So we know for sure that we're going to be tracking the number of resumes and interviews for this particular as a metric for that department. And then from a qualitative side, we may want to know how many interviews does it take for our participants to gain employment. So this really speaks to two things. One is does the career manager have everything that they need or fully understand the customers enough to prepare them? Two, what are the larger barriers our customers are having? And then also, do we have the right opportunities for the customers to gain employment? And so you have the quantitative and the qualitative the goals here, metrics here. And then we added on here for post-placement for retention. How many post-placement touch points are we having with those customers is another area that can be measured. And the reason you'd measure that is because we have to help 200 of those 300 students maintain employment. So once they gain employment, if we stop talking to them, they're more likely to fall off and not retain employment. So we want to know the number of post-employment touch points that we have. Then there's some metrics that you may have overall for the organization that you may not, it might not be something that you're holding your direct teams accountable to, but it's a marker and it's a goal that you have as an organization, or it's something that's important to your stakeholders. And so in this case, the organization is looking at the average wage per participant. They're looking at whether or not a higher wage helps for longer retention. And so that's something that the organization as a whole may be looking at or have as a target, an internal target for themselves of something to measure for performance. So, go on, Samantha? Yep, we have.
No, I was just gonna say, and remember, the nice piece about this is that these are the key indicators. And so some of these will also give you additional information either on the qualitative side or the quantitative side. So while you're not measuring a specific item, these things can still influence and give you some more information to influence some other areas of your business.
Mm-hmm.
And
these are,
key.
Yes, sorry. And just to clarify, these are examples, quick examples of metrics that you would set in these areas, but they're not complete. They're not absolute for these areas. These are just examples that are much more obvious that we start at. And then you really want to minimize how much further you go from, again, like the number of opportunities you may have, the number of phone calls or engagements you're having with employers. That might be another tier another tier to having the right job opportunities, but you really want to begin from, we need opportunities. What do we need to get the opportunities? And as you're asking those questions, working backwards from the strategic goal, you can identify the key metrics that you should measure without over measuring. So now once you have the metrics that you are going to measure, and I would say, and just wrapping up with the metrics that you're going to measure, to complete the funnel all the way down from strategic goal, asking yourself, well, we need to place 300 students. So what do we need to place them? We need job opportunities. What do we need for job opportunities? We need phone calls to employers. What do we need for the phone calls to employers? we need access to telephones. I would think measuring how often you have access to telephones would be too far to go. So as you keep working backwards from the strategic goal, you want to write out and do the activity of working backwards from it, but you want to stop at so stop at a level where you're not overly measuring things that don't speak directly to the ultimate outcome that you're looking for, because you don't want your team to become exhausted and demoralized by being overly measured if it's not directly impacting the work that they do with their customers. And I'd invite you to any questions that you have about establishing what to measure that we just covered. I invite you to write those questions into the chat because we will have time to cover them at the end. So now we're going to move on to targets for metrics. So you know now that one of your metrics is the number of job opportunities you have coming within your organization, but you want to put targets towards it. Well, how many job opportunities? You want, how frequently do we want to measure it? How are we going to measure it? There are many questions that will come up around once you have this metric, but the first thing you have to do is set a target for it. And we invite you and encourage you to look at a few data points when you're thinking of setting a target. You want to look at currently, how are you performing? If you weren't measuring job opportunities before, if you weren't measuring it systematically, you can use anecdotal information or even some of the information you may have placed in different spreadsheets to determine, well, how many job opportunities do we have coming in? Or if you have specific outcomes you've achieved before, you can use those to determine where you are right now. I would say if you don't have that information readily available and it's too difficult to access, that's okay, because you can begin with a benchmark and then always adjust going forward. That's why we mention being open and adaptable, because you'll need to do that if you don't have metrics in place at the moment. Then the industry benchmarks, there might be reports within your industry published in regards to different metrics to look at and what's possible. You can use that as a resource when you're determining what's the targets. Your staff resources, how many team members do you have? What are the resources available to you? And this is one area that really impacts in office versus remote. So if you are working remotely and all of your team members don't have access to technology, this is going to impact the targets that they would have for this specific metric. It may require adjustments. Frequency of data collection. For teams, often we are measuring performance monthly. So month over month, we're measuring performance, or it could be quarterly. We recommend that during this time where you're working remotely, especially if you're newly remote, to make the frequency more for a very specific period of time of say 45 to 90 days. Maybe if your frequency of measuring the metric is 30 days, maybe you make it a weekly check-in just at the beginning while everyone's getting comfortable with the new norm. And then when you realize that everyone is more comfortable and you have all of the tools you need and mechanisms for measuring, you can feel free to adjust to a frequency that works better for you. We recommend having short-term and long-term targets. So taking your annual targets, the 300 individuals that you want to help gain employment, and breaking that down into if you have 300 people that you want to gain employment, you need opportunities for them, let's say 1,200 opportunities, working backwards from that to break that goal into monthly targets, as well as you still have your long-term annual target. And then it's so important to know when enough is enough, right? So like, what's enough in regards to the targets? And so right now during COVID, where things are quite volatile and we're all learning a lot during this time, especially for newly remote teams, we'd suggest keeping the targets much more achievable, because morale is already taking an impact with the team. Your customers are feeling it as well. But if you can have targets that make them a bit more reachable initially while you're figuring out what is available and what is possible. And so I would say reaching for the stars right now might not, even though I'm a huge fan of reaching for the stars right now to say, okay, we're going to set the goal higher than we ever have This month may not be the best strategy considering all of the changes. However, you can start low and always increase it over the next couple of months. And once you've measured for a few weeks, as that we mentioned from that 45 to 90-day pocket, as you're measuring the results, you can then make adjustments and increase or decrease as the data speaks to that. And then we want to speak about balancing customer impact with employee morale. So some of you may have high demand from your customers, and you also have employees who may not have all of the resources and time and things of that sort because they're working from home and they're newly remote. So this is why we suggest a multi-tiered team working group for this, because then you're able to have insights around how do we get to all of our customers we really want to service, and how do we make sure those metrics, we are using those metrics to move progress forward, but also how do we do it without burning out the team? Because if your team burns completely out, then your customers aren't getting the help they need. And then for accountability during this time, having clear metrics and targets is really important in regards to accountability. But once again, as we're speaking about over the 45 to 90-day bucket of time that you've allocated for putting these, for either reintroducing metrics during this COVID period or introducing metrics as a whole, really working with your team, not so much in a punitive manner around, oh, you didn't hit this target. Really, this is the learning phase before your targets are finalized. And so examples of how we can move from the metric to actual targets for it. So we had number of job opportunities for account management. Here we want to have 100 new job opportunities per month, and we want the team member to have an average those jobs to have an average time to fill of 30 days. For career management, we want 95% of the individuals who are enrolled to receive a completed resume. And we want those individuals to have to require 4 interviews for placement. Now, these are benchmarks. So the 4-to-1, that may be possible when you're working in an office. It may be possible for you to work with a customer, for your team to work with a customer in the office and set them up with employers who come on site for hiring events and things of that sort, and that they can gain employment after 4 interviews. But while everyone's working remotely, it might not be feasible that 4-to-1 is possible for the number of interviews they're going on into placement. And so that's why you want to give a little grace during this time and during that 45 to 90-day period to make sure that you're able to adjust and pivot as possible, and you're learning together.
Yeah, I mean, and the same is true even for the average time to fill of 30 days. You could need to adjust that number as well, because possibly organizations are just maybe hiring a little bit more slowly, or they might need to do a little bit more of their own work around who they can hire and how many and things like that. So there's certain graces that you're just going to have to give your team as they sort of try to absorb the changes that are coming as a result of the time that we're in, for both your organization specifically, but also for your clients and the others that you all serve.
Totally agree. And that's why we're also mentioning you don't want to spend too much time. If you don't know what the number is, start somewhere, and then you use this period of time to get you to the exact number. But you want to outline the metric and set a target for it.
And I think it's so important when you have created these metrics that you create a systematic method to track and monitor the metrics. So who owns the target, and when are you monitoring those targets? So who's responsible, but also who's going to create the reports, who's going to create the tracking mechanism, who's going to update the tracking mechanism. And oftentimes these are either shared activities, or the people who created them are not necessarily the same people who are monitoring them. So you want to really make sure that you have clear reporting structures about who is managing what and who is responsible for what. Also, what is the schedule for checking the progress? You know, I think that oftentimes kind of like a watched pot, right? So sometimes we check too often. And is that the right schedule? And so there is a little bit of the learning process. Typically a week to 10 days can sometimes be, in this COVID moment, probably a really good time to check, because that's kind of the frequency with which changes begin to happen and you can pivot quickly. But often, and you and your organization and the specific metric you have to figure out, because sometimes a week is too quickly to measure every week, but also sometimes once a month is not frequently enough. So you really have to try to strike the right balance and the right time frame for your specific both metric and organization. And then the software tools. Some of us have really robust tools, whether they're CRMs or really proprietary databases and things like that. And some of us just have a good old Excel spreadsheet. And whatever you have, the important part is that you use it, and that your teams know exactly how to use it and where to place information so that you can get the best data possible. The other piece is, what reports can you get from either of those two mechanisms? So, can you pull reports out of your CRM, and what are those reports and what details can they give you? Also, or how can we create our Excel spreadsheet so that we can generate the kind of data that we want and pull the information that we want out of it? This is Millie's wheelhouse of software tools.
This is one of my favorite areas. And the reason is because often we can start out strong. You know what? We've had this meeting, we've established our metrics, we have our targets. And then when we get to the sustainability and the tracking, sustainability and monitoring, often the commitment kind of dies off. And in order to keep your team highly engaged, to know whether or not the metrics you've put in place are working, and to basically use them to increase your reach and impact for your customers, it's important to really outline everything on this page. So with the monitoring schedule, one point I wanted to add to what Samantha mentioned is during a time where it's high change, high stress, I would recommend, and being mindful, we're not talking about your overall communication structure, because people may be completely exhausted by meetings. So if you are have a monitoring schedule, I would suggest having it mapped out in advance, not that you're kind of reverting back to figure out, oh, we should check in and look at these numbers, right? So schedule that in advance, and having leads on each of these areas is important for the target. Who's the lead? Who owns it? And who's going to create the reports? Doing that will make it much easier so that you're not kind of having to revert back. Whenever you have to revert back to plan monitoring or see who's doing reports and no one actually owns it, it just makes it much more difficult. So I would say start with more frequent check-ins for monitoring, and then decrease it. So explain to your team why, maybe make it a huddle, 15-minute huddle, explain to your team the purpose, and then work backwards from it to make it less check-ins. And the reason is because if you check in too infrequently and it comes a month and a half later, you realize there's an issue that you didn't know of that you could have fixed if you had known a month earlier. So we have an example here of a basic Excel sheet. The reason we put it on here, an example of how to track your metrics, we put it here because often metrics are overcomplicated, and I've built extremely lavish CRM dashboards within my organizations. I've built extremely lavish spreadsheets for myself because I'm a data nerd. However, the sheets and the tracking mechanisms that worked best for me were simple, and they were easy for my team to understand. Now, whatever was super complex that I used for myself was fine, or for others who were high-level data geeks like me, it was fine. Or even for stakeholders, maybe it's a much more robust and eye-catchy system you're using. However, for your teams, I found a really simple system, a really simple tracking mechanism to work. And we're showing this really for now if you've had to change because of COVID. If you've had to make a significant change and something is going to, in your metrics or your targets are going to adjust because of COVID, and you don't have the resources to have a system admin change your dashboards in your CRM, you can use a basic Excel sheet to keep yourself on track. Waiting for the lavish, really beautiful tracking mechanism can be really harmful to your organization. So almost most people, you can almost find at least one person in your org that can create a simple Excel sheet. Get that person to do it so that you can measure now. It's better for you to have things measured that are not really pretty than to wait and have a very pretty mechanism, but not know that there are certain key areas that need your focus within your organization. And so here in this example, you can see we have the youth enrolled metric that's led by the career management lead. That person is the person who's accountable to that. And then we have a operations support team member who creates the quarter to date report and distributes it to the team on the first Friday of each quarter. It should be that clearly outlined so that you as a leader, you're not going to the person to remind them. You're not having team members come to you to say, hey, where's this information? And you're having to get reports created. You want to be proactive about this to have it all outlined in advance. Okay, so.
This is the fun part for me. As we look at the implementation and the team buy-in, you want to make sure that everyone knows how to win. So you want to take a little bit of time to create an implementation plan. And you can even do some of this work with the small group that you had working on the metrics themselves. But you want to really create an implementation plan. You want to list the targets and make sure that everyone understands the metric. What are we measuring? Why are we measuring it? How are we going to measure it? What field are from our CRM or what column from our Excel spreadsheet are we utilizing to pull, each number for how something is calculated? And really make sure that they understand that granular level. And that will even help in your tracking and your monitoring and your training, because if people understand where data is being pulled from, they typically will be much more likely to put the data in the right place. You want to make sure that there's a rollout schedule and a training schedule, and people know and are communicated with ahead of time. And inside that implementation plan, you want to create a communication schedule. You want to be very, very sure that everybody understands exactly what's coming, and there's a timeline for that. And I think that just having the benefit of knowing that things are coming and when they should be expected is super, super helpful to people. Even if you change those dates and you communicate that, that's okay to people, but not knowing is where you get some of the chaos and confusion. Also, make sure that you understand, again, tracking and monitoring. Is everybody adopting this process? Is everybody, where are we? Monitoring and making sure that if there is a hiccup, right, either that data doesn't look right, and so maybe a field you're pulling from is not registering, or something on the back end isn't clicking or isn't working correctly. So make sure that that is really well articulated to folks. A metrics one pager. I think Millie has taught me this over time, but really, if you can't put all of the information on a one pager, it might be too much information. So really think about really your ability to communicate the metrics, have people understand them in a clear and concise manner, and you can to move the team forward. Also, ensuring each team member can easily access their own performance and progress. And people ask why that's important. People usually want to know if they're on track, and empowering them to really own that, as well as the leader of the team or the leader of the organization, having everyone be able to see into that is so important. And it's so important for the buy-in. It ensures that folks can really do a pulse check. I like to say that the worst thing ever is when a manager is in a room communicating information that the employee or team member didn't expect. So you want to make sure that they know where they stand, as well as you being able to quickly and easily see where they stand. Also, understand that this is not a one and done. So training is an ongoing activity. And the better you train and the more often that you train, the more confident you can be in your data integrity. Because you can anticipate and you can see and you understand where folks are having issues, where folks are having hiccups, where some bottlenecks are. You learn things like, oh, we thought we would be able to upload that document, or we thought that those things spoke to each other, but now we know that they don't. So you can switch and change processes, procedures, anything you need to do, you can move quickly if folks are regularly being trained and reminded of information, particularly information they may not be using on a day-to-day basis. Also, something that Millie and I have seen from our clients quite often is they create a plan, they create these metrics, they create the targets, and they pivot really quickly. So they're 15 days in and they say, oh no, this isn't working. Let's move back to something else, or let's change the numbers, or let's make an adjustment. And quite often, 15 or even 30 days isn't enough time to quite see if you have all of the information you need. So give yourself about 45 to 90 days to gather the data and understand, okay, I see now a trend. I can see some consistent outcomes. I have enough data points where I can make some good comparisons. So for remote teams, especially right now, in order to say this is working or not working, or this is having the type of impact we want it to have on our clients or it's not, you really need to stick with your plan for about 45 to 90 days so that you have enough data where you can really make sure that you are having quality assessments of the information that's coming in, and not just you're not sort of making a permanent decision on a blip on the radar screen because of some momentary shift or change in the greater context.
That's so important. Thank you so much, Samantha, for emphasizing this. Also because in creating the monitoring schedule, the tracking and monitoring schedule in advance will help with this, because even if you aren't changing, often team members revert back to what was being done before, or they make changes because they are engaged and excited about their work and they feel like, you know what, this would be better, and they change it. And if you don't have a check-in and communication schedule and a monitoring schedule outlined in advance that your team's aware of, you may not know that that's has occurred. And then also, if you make that change after 15 days, your team could be still doing what was going on before, or not very clear on what the objectives were. And so the information you have is not quality information. And so we're really excited about you being able to make an impact with your team. Today, we've outlined how the basics, getting a good team assessment, being able to identify what your actual KPIs are. And although most teams are focused on what should we measure, we really want to talk about targets, implementation, and monitoring, because if you have clear targets and then you have a good implementation and monitoring plan, the information you get from that will help you to know whether or not you need to measure what you need to measure, and if the metrics you have are sufficient. And so, and then going on to having your team training and sticking to a period of time to assess whether or not these metrics work. So we've gone through all of that with you today. And for some of you, you might have gotten the answer to make the one check on your team to be all set and ready to go in regards to measuring your remote team performance. But for others, you may still be trying to really take a deeper dive, or maybe you're at point one, or you're reassessing and having to reestablish your metrics as a whole within your teams. within your teams. And so for that, we are your partners for virtual working Bliss. And we have a service, our Metrics for High Performing Team service, that is a performance management bundle to support you in getting one team within your organization to establish and implement goals and metrics that promote high performance. And when we are working with your team, we want you to walk away with increased clarity of your purpose and goals, increased confidence to pursue your targets because everyone's on the same page, alignment on the impact you're making, increased team synergy, less confusion, and of course, higher outcomes. And what we, and basically what we're doing is taking everything we shared with you today and being able to do that with your team directly. And so some of these have varying values. Many individuals that come in to support teams can work either hourly to support you, and you don't know when you're going to get to the point of it being done. We will work with you completely to ensure that all of these deliverables are met. You know, you have your basics, you know what you're going to measure, you know how you're going to measure it, you have your targets, your implementation and monitoring plan, and your team is fully trained. We will work with you on all of that. And we have one set price of $2,000 for that team. And so we want to show you that this is how we can support you to achieve your goals with your performance team as a whole. And so with that, we're sure we can provide exceptional value, but really the goal is to get you to reaching the targets that you are interested in achieving as a team by clarifying what your KPIs are and what's the plan to ensure that they're providing value to your team as a whole. And so we're really excited that you joined us and that we could share these tips and share how we can support you. And now we want to open up the floor for questions. Okay, so we have a question here. How do we balance setting metrics for moving performance targets? COVID-19 has made us pivot daily. Okay, this is a great question. I think it really goes back to having your strategic, your organization purpose and your team purpose very clearly outlined, and then knowing your strategic objectives and goals. So I guess my question to the person who asked this is, are you clear on what the actual objectives and goals are for your team? Okay. So if it's unclear on what the actual targets are, your metrics shouldn't be changing on a daily basis. It could be that you have not taken a moment to sit down to get the actual basics outlined. So I would say, going back to the slide where we discussed doing an assessment of your team, establishing the purpose of your departments, who are your customers, and also what's your ultimate goal, and working backwards from there. It could be that potentially how you're servicing a customer is changing a bit frequently during this time frame because you decide you wanted to use Zoom, but it's no longer available, or you had a call set up, but your phone isn't working. Those things may come up. Those are fires that you have to put out. But the ultimate, your metrics should not be moving. If your performance targets are moving, there is an issue with the basics, and it's not clear enough that the full team understands it, or the leadership hasn't established it and communicated it clearly to the team as a whole. And it could be that you're not setting a set period of time of that 45, 90 days to assess the impact overall before changing. So you're changing so quickly that you don't really know what's working or what isn't working. Okay, any other questions? We had a question, sorry? Hello? Samantha, was that you?
It's fine.
Okay. We had another question about metrics for a support team. And so when you're a support team and you're not directly forward facing to your customers, how do you establish metrics? And I think that one of this is a question that comes up often across organizations where they're providing extreme value internally within the organization, and even sometimes their customer support on the back end, but they don't know what metrics make the most sense for their organization. For example, if you're in an HR department, an operations department. And so there were a few thoughts that we have around that. Samantha, you're really, really knowledgeable on the HR side. Can you speak to some ways that you're able to establish metrics in HR, even though it was not directly customer facing in the department?
Sure. I think you still have a customer. It might not be the organization's customer, but the internal teams of your organization are still your customers. So it's kind of really taking a deep dive in who do we serve? Who do we service? And really understanding that while you don't have the external client of your organization is not who you serve, you still serve someone within the organization. So it's about looking at and identifying your internal clients. Number two, I think oftentimes it's a little bit harder for certain departments because they don't have as many. So many people did this and so many people did that. I mean, I think you can do those things around things like benefits. I think you can do those things around enrollment. To some degree, you can do those around participation numbers. However, there are a lot of ways that you can still get quantitative metrics for qualitative things. For instance, employee engagement surveys, specific department surveys around a number of various issues as well. So there are a lot of ways that you can still tease out metrics from something that doesn't quite have as many clear-cut metrics. Also, in HR, there are still going to be metrics such as time to fill. If you're a recruiter, how long it takes to fill a position is a metric that you can usually get and use as a KPI for that specific department. So there are some metrics. It might take you a little bit more time to tease out, and it might take you a little bit more time and conversation to understand how your function impacts the greater organization and translate those, but you can usually do those in similar fashion.
Yes. And so, and basically recommended going through the same process, but your customer, knowing who your customer is, right? And your stakeholders, but those are internal customers. So are there any last questions? Okay, so we're really excited that you all joined. I want to share a little bit about what happens next. We're going to follow up to this. The follow-up to this webinar will be an email where we will give you a recording of this webinar. We'll share more with you about how we can partner with you to achieve virtual working bliss and to minimize the sort of whiplash that your team may be having with daily changes, to share with you how we can support you in minimizing that and putting together a strong plan, but then also a sustainability plan so it can support you long term. We invite you to follow us on social media and to remain connected with Manager Rue for resources for any of the team challenges or initiatives that you have going on in the future. Thank you so much again for joining, and have a wonderful day.